Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight, once again, the redoubtable Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Now, we generally start off these conversations with some kind of attempt to pry out from the interstices of your well-regarded mind your political plans. And I know there's been a lot of talk on the street. I've heard it in Macon that, we have a lot of big-time elections coming up. Is your hat in any of the rings thus far?
If it is, I think I'll be the last to know. So if
right?
you hear anything along these lines, please report back.
I think later we might think about a write-in campaign, but
let's please don't. So.
We'll bring that up in another venue. Well, there's a lot to talk about out there, and probably the headlines that have captured the world's attention is the Russian attack on the Ukraine and the American foreign policy to respond to this. Now, we're down here in our small little venue, Macon, Georgia, so we're at some distance from the decision makers that discover these things or probe these things. Right now, as you understand it, do you approve of the American foreign policy? And I'll say some of the particulars attached to it. Number one, the plan is not to give any planes to Poland so they can then go to the Ukraine. That's a plan. The plan is not to send any U.S. soldiers there. Although there's been a lot of confusion about what the president means, but seemingly the response to chemical weapons will be guarded. There doesn't seem to be any pressure on the Europeans continue to take in Russian energy and send Moscow money. The U.S. plans to send liquefied natural gas to Europe. They also have said, although our country is crowded with illegal immigrants now, millions of them, they consent to take up to 100,000 Ukrainians to come here. Well, that's sort of some of the ideas out there. What do you think about this? Comments? That's a very small statement about the complexities of U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I generally think it's the best of a bad lot. That's probably, it reminds me of what Churchill once said about democracy, that it's the worst form of government except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. Before I get into the actual details that you've mentioned, I guess we should start with what are the fundamentals of American foreign policy? What do we try to achieve with our foreign policy? And I think you see two fundamental forces at work here. The first fundamental force is the idea of American exceptionalism, which ironically enough is a label, as far as I can tell, that was first applied to us with derision by none other than Joseph Stalin, that he saw nothing exceptional about American history. Normally when you hear American exceptionalism, it's used in a positive context. The idea that when the separatists and the Puritans arrived in New England in the 1600s, they were deliberately trying to get away from the corruptions and evils of Europe. They were saying that Europe was a blood-soaked continent, that they had fought for thousands of years over God, over economy, over land, over everything. And so they wished to found the city on the hill, the New Jerusalem, the place where they were going to build the perfect community, the perfect Christian community. And not only would it be for themselves, they would become the model for the rest of the world. And so you can see whether or not that's true. It's what we have thought of ourselves. And there are many ways in which obviously we have done horrific things.
Many citizens that came from Africa had a slightly different viewpoint about their journey here. Yes.
And yet even with that, and we still have problems with that today. Yes, we had slavery, but so did most cultures down to the mid 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. We were the first country to field an army to end slavery in the history of the world. So, but yeah, I'm not trying to excuse that. Yes, we've done horrible things.
Yes.
As I like to tell my class, The difference between Nazi Germany and the United States is our Holocaust worked. How many full-blooded Native Americans do we know? And yet this is still our view of ourselves, and this has worked its way into our foreign policy. The idea of making the world safe for democracy, of being a guarantor of Europe's stability, the thing that led to NATO. Now, was there self-interest in that? Yes, of course there was. But there was, if you look at the Marshall Plan as well, in isolation it was a very generous thing. So the idea that we will sit here and watch an international bully, international pariah beat up on a next door neighbor that has very little on-paper ability to defend itself, it rankles. It goes against the grain of American exceptionalism. On the other hand, there's the idea of American isolationism. Yes, we did come over here to get away from there, and that while we were a weak nation in our first decades of existence, we did not have any business of getting involved in European affairs. We could be squashed. And so keep the Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe. Don't let them bring their problems over here. Let's don't make their problems our problems. And that is also part of American foreign policy, and a lot of it is now vestigial, a lot of it has gone away, but it still exists when you're talking about a potentially very unstable person who has the biggest nuclear arsenal on Earth, and of course I'm referring to Putin, if we do anything to escalate this, he is fully capable of calling us and raising us. And when you're dealing with weapons of mass destruction, that is a very dangerous game to play.
Well, that was a good run around the bases. So I think it was interesting to look at the nuances of American foreign policy as it plays a role in the tactics of how to respond. I might throw one more comment in the duality you created, and that is globalism. To me, sort of exceptionalism and isolation are similar in a way. They're part of the same thing. America's special, it's different, and we can either close our doors or open our doors, but nevertheless, we are not really connected to the rest of the world in an immediate way. And I think the globalism, the idea is that we're just like anybody else. We're just like squirrels hopping around on the tree. You sort of talked about Joseph Stalin, and I made a reference to the African story. So certainly we're loaded with sin. I mean, as any country would be. I don't know if a country is without sin, just like humans are without sin. So all the events in American history or any country's history, it would be impossible to go back and say, well, everything was 1, 2, 3 by today's standards. We can say the Canadians. Let's look at the Canadians. I mean, aren't they pretty benign up there? Well, apparently they did some terrible things to Native Americans, and they were also mean. The Anglo-Canadians were mean to the French. They were mean to the Eskimos. There are all kinds of, they polluted. There are all kinds of bad things that the Canadians did, and we'll let it go. We'll let it go at that. But so navigating the world is quite complicated, and I think one of the first things to get into is that I think it's fair to say that America's behavior in the past has not always been up to what we would call reasonable contemporary moral standards, as no country has. And then how do we navigate the future? But one of the things that's important in our national identity, maybe I've said this before, is the idea that, well, we are somewhat without sin, or at least our morality is better than other lesser nations. And that's what distinguishes the country. There's an American church. Our behavior is righteous, and we make mistakes, we correct them. We're constantly going through painful periods of self-appraisal. So that's part of our psyche. And finally, you get to the point that because of the lushness of our land, the resources we have, the common language we speak, that we are the world's lifeboat. And that the world can count on us to act in a moral way, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're in this issue where the world is asking, what what are you going to do about this set of circumstances? And right now, the ball is being tossed back and forth a little bit with the political dialogue, and it's pretty complicated, isn't it? So there are gurus that are out there that really watch the world geopolitical situation and the world order, and they watch that, and because we're on a small planet, it would be inconceivable that war broke out anywhere. So war is really just a terrible idea anywhere, and that a large nation would attack a small one. Supposedly we were past that. So I think everyone can agree that what happened with Russia attacking the Ukraine was incompatible with the post-war world order, and it was bad. It went way over the 50-yard line, and so what are we going to do about it? And right now, the country is depending on, I would say, President Biden's wisdom as to direct American policy. And just frankly, I mean, I can say this, I mean, other people have said it, there seems to be substantial cognitive impairment. So when a person has the downfall of old age, one of the things that happens is there's no restraint in what the person says. Normally there's kind of your thoughts and your words are censored depending on the circumstances that you're in. So you're cautious about saying anything that would be offensive. If you're at a polite gathering, certainly an off-color joke, you wouldn't want to do that. Or I mean, there are all kinds of things that people know about. And so it would appear that he's constantly blundering, if I can use that word, blundering. It also would appear that the direction of American foreign policy is not directly in his hands. I would say that. Maybe I'm wrong. Well, maybe that's overstating it. But for whatever's going on, the way that the country is responding to this great crisis needs some attention. What is the right thing to do? Are we getting appropriate response from the national government? Is there some kind of cabal of advisors that really are the puppeteer?
Well, there's always a cabal of advisors.
But
no
are
matter how
they
good a leader is.
puppeteers? Well, okay.
But I want to back up before we get to the Biden administration. I want to back up to this issue of globalism that you raised a couple of minutes ago, and I am very, let's say I'm very critical of the pan to globalism. That yes, we have become and continue to become far more interconnected economically in terms of the supply and demand of raw materials, the very fact of the environment and the ecosystem, which is the commons that we have to deal with as a species if we don't want to destroy our one and only living place. But for the last 120 or 130 years, especially, you've been hearing this idea that globalism is the answer and it's inevitable and it's going to solve all the problems and we have to deal with it. At least as far back as what was the book, The Great Illusion, which was written just before World War I, that argued, well, the idea of a general European war is unthinkable because of all of the international banking connections. Today it would be the SWIFT system, and so it's just ridiculous. And look what happened a few years later. So these people that say that, well, what Russia's doing, it's not according to the rules of the game, reminds me of the old saw about the scientists who very carefully studied the anatomy of the bumblebee and concluded that it could not fly. It's impossible for a bumblebee to fly. So even as we become more interconnected, we still have that lizard brain that sees the other as threat, that we naturally revert to tribalism. And you can't just make this part of human neuroanatomy go away when it's been engineered over at least hundreds of thousands of years to act this way. No amount of globalism in the world is going to change that. So that's just a naive response. So.
Well, you know, I'm happy. I feel like my missionary work has not been wasted on our interchanges here. That's exactly my opinion.
Yeah, I've incorporated a great deal of your idea of neuroanatomy.
That is exactly my opinion. That's exactly what's going on now. And so just to wake up and the ultimate story, just getting to the highest mountain, is that we have to recognize that we have these archaic brains that were not fashioned to exist in the 21st century. So we're well suited to tackle cave bears and get enough food to support our kith and kin if we have to steal it or whatever. And the trials of life, our brain is there to make certain that we as individuals and as our tribe prevail. So this is part of the weave of our species. And so the globalism is in my opinion, is a good path to go down with as far as one can go down that path. And it's the difficulties of pursuing it. There's a huge amount of naivete that we can make everything go 1, 2, 3. We'll all be we'll be in Kansas.
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya. It'll be this sunlight is in your hair or whatever. Everything will be great. And no, we're going to, and we go with a cyclical view of history, and one could well say, well, here we are. It's the same old story again. This is exactly what happened in a way after the Napoleonic Wars, 1914. These things happened, and actually they happened for many of the same reasons. And we can expect this kind of behavior. One of the biggest things right now would be to say, well, if we can expect this kind of behavior, is it good, is it bad? What are we going to do about it? It's inevitable. How do we handle this? And it would be reasonable to have a major interchange about what's going on and to look at the fact this happened, to see it's like post-accident story. Let's go through and dissect why this happened, how this happened. And a lot of it is referable to the interstices of Russian politics. Putin's background, which apparently, I mean, I'm told he had a very hard scrabble life in St. Petersburg, and he was a little guy, and the big guys picked on him, and he was very pugnacious and was a judo expert, and went here and had this sort of Tiger-like intensity that is often makes for a successful politician, but not an appropriate world leader. So that's one of the things to think about. Do we actually think about the people that around the world that have their hand on the nuclear trigger? Do we actually think about that? Do we think about the way that the Chinese elect people, the Russians put their people in power, or us? I mean, look at, I was critical of the president just now. I mean, and the process that put him in there. I mean, how do things work in a nuclear era? It's really quite spooky to have this person there. I'm just going to say that. It's very, very spooky to be so far removed from any possibility of changing the situation. The person on television appears to me to be quite cognitively impaired.
Well, I think
that's not a good. I mean, I'll say that. I mean, that's.
Well, I think there's a disconnect there, and I mean, accepting that arguendo, and I don't know enough to know that the only thing that he has clearly done that bothers me was his statement a few days ago, as we're recording this, that something along the lines of this guy, referring to Putin, Biden said this guy's got to go or he cannot be allowed to remain. Which was apparently an ad-lib statement, not part of the speech, which suggested regime change. And of course, his handlers immediately tried to walk that statement back. And the attempt to walk it back was absolutely oafish. Well, what the president meant was he can't be allowed to continue to exercise power over Ukraine or something. But Biden came out once again just in the last day or two as we're recording this, and I think he handled it as best as anybody could. Biden said, it was an appeal from the heart. It was not a statement of policy change. It was just a statement of emotional outrage. And I think that
I agree with that.
I think that's a very good hand. But,
that's good. I agree with that.
But whether or not you think Biden is good or bad or being a puppet of somebody else, let me ask you, you're president now. What would you do? Forget Biden. What would you do to try to handle this situation?
Well, firstly, I'd get all the information that I can get, and then I would put a little subcommittee together like Kennedy did, and I would get different opinions. And I actually, talking about the American...
As in John F. Kennedy for Vietnam, right?
No, for Cuba.
Yeah. Okay.
For the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way... Now, I think actually the policy is okay. I mean, it's okay. I have no... And you could really blunder. I mean, and so... the handlers are doing a pretty good job. If that's the deal, I mean, whoever the handlers are, I suspect there's some wise people that are there. And what should the policy be? Well, the policy should be you've really violated the law, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The law of the world order is that a big country cannot attack a little country. And then what happens when that occurs is all the little countries get together and they form pacts with among themselves to fight back. And you get and so once something has happened, a heinous act, then things just escalate. And I want to make this comment too. Reading the New York Times, which I'll let it go at that I make a point of reading it. Mm-hmm. There was and my observation is that often things are buried on page 18 of great consequence. So one of the things happening maybe with all newspapers or all media is they sort of put on the top fold the big points they want to put across. So they censor what's going to go, they want to go in your brain. Here's the information we want in your brain. On the other hand, there are some facts that if you look through the paper, you can discover that they don't, in page 18, that they don't think is so consequential, but they publish them. And it was about apparently a pretty real story of Ukrainian soldiers torturing Russian soldiers.
Yes.
And that is so normal. And if you're in Russia and you see this, then it's just going to enrage you the same way the Ukrainians are being outraged. And the media is controlled there, so you can really hop up everyone because of the media control on both sides of the story. And it is worth putting out there that war is all kinds of horrible, horrible things happen in war on both sides. And armies are brutalized when they're in the trenches. They become the horror of the experience in person-to-person warfare is, it just dehumanizes people.
Well, this is why, especially in the age of modern industrialized war, and it's always been the case, but it gets exponentially worse as the killing range and the killing power of weapons increases, that if you read what Clausewitz has to say about it, and if you read what Bismarck has to say about it, and I think Bismarck is probably the first political leader who really got Clausewitz and really understood it. That
they spoke the same language.
Yeah, they did. that the minute you unleash the military, the minute you unleash let's slip the dogs of war and commit to that, you as a statesman, as a Bismarck, as a Metternich, you have lost control of the process to a degree. It's like letting, and I mean, this is not a slur on the military.
It's a dogfight.
It's just, it is. And things are going to happen that you would not countenance, that you do not want to happen. Things happen that are not foreseeable. It's a crapshoot, and it's just, and Sherman, who I think, who certainly didn't read Clausewitz to my knowledge, but I think who at some level was an instinctive Clausewitzian. He said, war is hell. It's not, let's don't beat around the bush. It's horrible. It's supposed to be horrible. The way to get it to an end is unleash as much horror as possible. Now,
I'm glad you raised that point. Now we can segue into war crimes.
Yes.
So did Sherman create war crimes? Is he guilty of war crimes? How about the U.S. And Afghanistan? I mean, we well remember there was some allegedly bad person there, and we blew them up and killed a whole family.
Yes.
Was that a war crime? And what about bombing everywhere? Dresden, bombing people, bombing this, bombing that, killing civilians, trying to starve people. I mean, isn't that just part of war?
Well, this is...
And where is the notion of war crime?
Well,
I mean, I'm in favor of restraint. But
well, this is probably, we only have five or so minutes left,
yes.
so we probably want to wait and do this one in a separate episode.
I think we shall.
I don't think we're going to wrap this, but I do think you've to do a few superficial things here. War crimes has a technical meaning. It doesn't mean bad things that happen during wartime. Everything that happens in wartime is bad. I mean,
yes.
if you're out the killing fields. But when you're talking about war crimes, first of all, at least in the Western tradition, and I do not have the background to speak for other traditions, but if you're looking at the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, war crimes emerge out of early Christian thought. And question number one is, well, here we are in the Bible Belt. Do you know what WWJD stands for?
No.
What would Jesus do? They don't teach that on Vineville?
Well,
Okay.
in Bible Methodist,
Okay.
I've heard it. I've heard that said, but
Yes.
I don't not initialized.
Okay, so
I've heard that said.
So any discussion of war crimes and where the concept of illegitimate actions in war, you have to start with WWJB.
Yes.
Who would Jesus bomb? And when you put it that way, that kind of puts it in perspective. So just as an introduction, we'll carry this on into another episode. But the big questions that concern the early theologians are, first of all, is it ever right for a people to go to war? And if so, what would permit that?
Moral war in St. Augustine.
Yeah, what would permit that? And secondly, once you have gone to war, how do you fight it? What are legitimate means of fighting a war, and what would be illegitimate means? And over time, as the international community began to develop norms by the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, you start getting these ideas of what is out of bounds, and it's usually just by consensus. The way I like to describe international law is trying to drive from here to Atlanta on I-75, but there's no state government, there are no state troopers, there are no local police officers. What's the speed limit? The speed limit is what the drivers themselves achieve a consensus on. So if the flow of traffic is at about 80 miles an hour, that's the speed limit. It's what the community of drivers have decided. So that's my short version. I think we'll have to wait for our next episode to try to apply that in the modern sense.
We shall. Let me just make one comment as we go on in our next session. One of the issues is using morality in war, and often the weaker party routinely says war crimes have been committed, there's something evil going on, and the stronger party who's able to inflict that nation's will on the weaker nation is in using the power to accomplish that nation's objectives is going to, by just the nature of the situation, injure innocent people. And so it is. War crimes are always put out there as part of the war process. Yes. We can talk about what exactly is a war crime in our next session.
Well, let's
all right.
do that.
At that point, I think we conclude. And thank you for being here, Buck.
Thank you, sir.
I know you're taking time away from your political
ambitions
to be here with us. But good.
It's
we'll
a pleasure.
talk.
Nope.
We'll talk. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.